I'm very rarely like shocked, but this
Yeah.
really came at me. They think that they're going to China to get jobs. And what actually happens when they get there is that they're basically forced into reproductive labor. The mother and they're not even married. The man's mother will be frequently very complicit in her rape. They will rape her until she gets married. They're paying as much as like $15,000 to get the youngest girls as possible, subject to them being less likely to miscarry. So it seems to be the ideal age is 15. Younger than 15, you run into birth rates.
Yeah.
But after she gives
the
family, they sell her to another family. And they recoup much of what they spent if they buy a young woman. It is truly grotesque. They don't want them as wives. They just want them for children. But the love jihad, to me, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. I said, let me get this straight. You are telling me that Muslim men are more attractive. They satisfy women better. Maybe they have better endowments.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you're basically saying. And therefore, I give up. Why don't you learn some foreplay? Why don't you learn some manners?
Okay, let's get a little bit politically incorrect. Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussain, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The Indian subcontinent, or South Asia, includes Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Maldives. It contains 1/4 of the world's population, the center of GDP, a global GDP, and 2 antagonistic nuclear-armed powers are there. It's been central to world history and the world economy for most of human history. Yet, to much of the world, it remains an area of darkness. There is a lively intellectual tradition in the subcontinent, and it is a place of endless, continuing debate and discussion, religious, political, philosophical, artistic, and more. On this podcast, it's an area which we have discussed several times from various insider perspectives. Today, we explore the region from somewhat of an outsider position, but a very knowledgeable and distinguished one that's sure to shed light from a different angle. Our guest today is Dr. Christine Fair, a Provost Associate Professor within the Security Studies Department within Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. She works in the political military affairs of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Her most recent book is titled In Their Own Words, Understanding the Lashkar-e-Taiba, published by Oxford University Press. So I am pleased to welcome Dr. Christine Fair. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. You know, in all those countries I just listed, there's a very important question I want to ask you. Who has the best food?
So, no, it's funny because, you know, I wrote a cookbook.
That's exactly why I'm asking you.
Yeah. So I'm really food obsessed. Like wherever I go, even in the States, I plan out my eating itinerary. which now that I'm going through menopause is a challenge because, you know, I can't just run it off like I used to. So, you know, it's really hard to say. I mean, I would say particularly as you move across, so there are these culinary things that are quite common. So once you enter, for example, once you cross the Indus, well, in Pakistan, and you move across the international border going into India, so there's this very broad North Indian / Punjabi tradition that's really quite similar, right?
Yeah.
If an alien just put you down, the only way you might know on which side of the international border you were on is if you were paying attention to the quantity of meat and or the quantity and quality of the vegetables. So, you know, that whole North Indian, they all look very similar, you know, the salan, which some people call the magic sauce. I don't particularly find that very interesting because it isn't very distinctive.
But I just want to, if you can just remind, the title of your book is Cuisines of the Axis of Evil and Other Irritating States, a dinner party approach to international relations. I just thought that was an amazing title, and that's why I just wanted to start off with that in a kind of funny way, but because, you know, that, because there are a lot of insights from that direction that I'm sure you know, that I want to pick up from you.
So, I mean, actually, I'm hoping to teach a course next year about what do we learn about history from food.
Yeah.
And so when I do my South Asia class, because, you know, I never really know what people know, but I start out with this North Indian / Punjabi salan. I said, do anyone eat, you know, North Indian food? And they'll like, yeah. Okay, well, what's in it? And they'll name off some of the ingredients. I said, okay, so the first ingredient that you just named is tomato. When did tomatoes arrive in the subcontinent? I mean, they don't arrive until the Portuguese land, right? Similarly with chilies, tamarind comes from Africa. And so I use it to kind of puncture this silly discussion about cultural appropriation, because we've been culturally appropriating for a really, really long time.
Yeah.
And this is like apparent in food. Like there was a
Irish potatoes, you know, and everything. Yeah.
I mean, there was
Italian sauce.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and where do they get their pasta from, right?
Yeah.
It's
China, Marco Polo.
You know, so it's all kind of interesting. And then there was a fascinating disputation at a liberal college here in the United States about dining hall serving banh mi, and that this was crude cultural appropriation. And I was like, what do you think banh mi is? Do you not know the history of that particular sandwich and the hundreds of years that the French were in Vietnam? So it's actually a serious cookbook. I mean, the United States is in it, and it's a topic that that's interested me in a really long time.
And I mean, and as you note, I mean, it provides a way to look at, you know, history and all the complexity, globalization and mixing and whatever, boundaries, political boundaries, their relevance and irrelevance, you know.
Well, also the thing that really strikes me is the complexity of the food and how difficult it is to prepare tells us a little bit about the political economy of the household.
Absolutely.
Right. So I was engaged to a Sardar in Delhi, and and of course the sabzi, you know, the vegetables, the garlic, the ginger. I mean, everything in India is so much smaller, right?
That's
it's not these GMO, you know, monster sabzi. It takes an army and or a daughter-in-law.
Yes.
And you know, before you could get in a jar very conveniently the chopped up garlic and the chopped up ginger. It tells you that there's this presumptive level of available female labor to make this food.
Yeah.
Right. To me, that was really telling about the political economy. Who's doing the cooking? And then who's doing the eating? Like for most of my time in South Asia, I would be treated like an honorary male. So I would be served with the men, and the women would tend to eat later after all of the men have eaten. So the other thing that has always struck me, people like to say that nothing brings people together like food, has been my experience. It's just the opposite.
Yeah.
The whole issue, I mean, look at what's happening in India with the vigilante cow killings. In Mumbai, it's gotten to the point where the Marathis who tend to eat meat and the Gujaratis who tend to be militant vegetarians, I mean, you're having efforts to cleanse entire condominiums of meat eaters. And that, I remember when I was there, a Gujarati tossed a Marathi out of the window for the crime of cooking chicken. So when I look at this,
I mean the food taboos and stuff too, because what's halal, what's vegetarian, if you're Jain, does it have onions in it, and so it gets into all the religious histories, the taboos, etc. And
caste, right? And caste.
Yeah, that's right. Who eats with whom?
That's right.
Yes, these sorts of things. So it really, and it shows the depth and complexity that the contemporary geographical borders mask and don't and violate in many ways, and probably distort deeper understandings and connections. So that's fascinating that you did that. I don't think anybody's ever done a book like that before, have they?
No, I don't think so.
No.
But so then think about this. This is when I teach my South Asia class. This is one of the most fascinating story of logistics at war, right? Most people, logistics is like the Rodney Dangerfield. It gets no respect, but without logistics, there is no war. So in World War I, over 1 million South Asians fought in World War I. And they fought along communal and caste lines.
Yeah.
So when they put their units on the ships, if you were a Brahmin, you had your Brahmin cook. If you were a Muslim, you had your halal cook.
Yeah.
The logistics of that is insane. And then maintaining that in trench warfare.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
I know, it blew me away when I just began thinking about the logistics of that. And the British were so desperate for that personnel that they accommodated it in every which way possible.
Yeah. I mean, even to this day, I mean, things like the Gurkhas, how important the role they have in the British overseas army and stuff like that. Yeah. Well, if we get back to the more strictly geopolitical aspect, you heard my little introduction there, and where I gave my a look into my perspective on the role of the region and so forth. What I mean, as a specialist yourself, who's written much more in the region than I have, definitely. Do you agree with that? Do you have a different assessment? What's your view of the region's place in the world historically, currently, and also in the future?
So, I mean, the region, this is really the curse of geography, right? So if you're Afghanistan, you have always been able to survive off of strategic rents, right? So really, going back to the Great Game era, Afghanistan played off Russian and British imperial interests. You look at a map of Afghanistan, this thumb, the Walking Corridor. Afghanistan got the Walking Corridor because the British and the Russians foisted it upon King Abdur Rahman. The idea being that if Afghanistan didn't get this little piece of territory, the British and Russian empires would share a border, and they understood that would increase the likelihood of outright conflict, right? So Afghanistan was really a rentier state going back to the Great Game period. And then in the early 20th century, when it ousted the British, it found itself in a situation: who's going to pay our bills, right? It's great we kicked the Brits out, but we also kicked out their checkbook. And then the Russians really stepped in to fill that void. And the Russians filled that void up until 1992. And when it stopped writing those checks, the Soviet-installed government of Najibullah, after the war ended, fell. and the country went to a period of almost a decade of Pakistani-backed internecine jihadi warfare, where Pakistan was throwing everything it could to try to get a preferred outcome, which ultimately culminated in the Taliban. So now we're in this period, this post-2001 period, where the United States has built the biggest government that has ever existed. And for years, I can tell you for the last 15 years, I've been a Cassandra saying, how is this place going to pay for itself? When the Americans don't have troops, they're not going to keep writing checks. And we go right back to 1992. So in the case of Afghanistan, this important geography that you identified has enabled it to exist without actually building the robust infrastructure of raising revenue domestically through taxation. And then, we go to Pakistan, which is also a rentier state of sorts. Yeah. Mostly because of luck, partly because of Afghanistan. Yeah. It's been able to extract rents from the United States in ways that have been very distorting for Pakistan. Yeah. And then we get to India. India is actually, I think Ed Luce wrote it best, in spite of the gods, in which he means to say India has progressed in spite of the government. Yeah. Right? The government has just been incredible constraint upon the creativity of Indian entrepreneurs, and the corruption has really imposed a lot of inefficiencies in distributions of service and so forth. So India is, on the one hand, it's the country that has the most potential in the region. But what's also fascinating about India is that there's so much variation within India. So if I were to look at, say, Kerala versus Gujarat, there's more variation there than there is looking at, say, India as a point observation to, say, Pakistan as a point observation.
Yeah, I always tell people, like, don't think of India as a country, think of it as a continent. It's like Europe. I mean, there's more people in Europe. Right. And I mean, it's like saying someone from Iceland and someone from Sicily are the same, or from Norway and Portugal. I mean, it's really that different. In fact, they have different scripts. It's and the federalism, more different in some ways. Sorry?
Right. And your comparison is especially apt because India is truly federal. Yeah. In the sense that, with the exception of a few issues like taxation and defense and foreign policy, the states themselves have considerable leeway to draft their own laws. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. So every state is a different investor climate. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and it's a different world. I mean, a state, is the size of many times larger than the size of many sovereign countries.
Oh my God! Look at Madhya Pradesh. Yes. It's just it's enormous if you think about it. Just yeah. I
mean, even like going back in classical, like reading Edward Gibbon when he's speaking about he talks about the wars in Asia are just so massive. When you think of like a European war, it's like a little skirmish. I mean, everything is just so much bigger throughout history. It's been like that on that side. Yeah.
I mean, geez, the numbers, just the scale to me it's always fascinating. Like my students, it never occurred to them that the British in India were not all white. Yeah. Right? It never occurred to them that the vast majority of the people suppressing Indians were in fact Indians themselves. Mm-hmm. And it never occurred to them to think of the British Imperial Army as the world's largest mercenary army.
That's right.
Right, yeah. Which it was. I mean, yeah. I mean, when did your family come to North America?
Right. No. Well, it's the Caribbean, right? So I'm.
Oh, you came by the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, right. So my ancestors are indentured laborers. So.
Well, I was going to say, so you have an even more fascinating tale.
That's right. It's with tied up with the East India Company. Yeah. And then even after the mutiny, a lot of people were sent to the plantations, including here around the world. So I'm hoping one of my ancestors was a mutineer, but I don't know for sure.
So again, most Americans have so I love the story of how Indians get to the Caribbean, right? Because slavery is banned, right, by the Brits. but you have, but they've also introduced, they've basically stolen sugarcane from South Asia.
Yeah.
But they didn't bring with them the technology to grow it.
Yeah.
So then they had to go back and they had to get these South Asians to actually do the sugarcane, which is an incredibly grueling work.
Yeah.
So basically, they're brought in as, but there are only certain communities that will come. I'm sure you've noticed this. Not every Indian community.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, partly it's where the East India Company were. I mean, the two, it's in Calcutta and Madras were the two points. But yeah, I mean, and so.
But it's also willingness to cross the sea.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Because certain castes believe that if you cross the sea, your soul would be condemned. There would be no moksha for you.
Yes, yeah. No, right? and I mean, for all our, because there's interesting stories of people who went back after the period of indenture and were rejected because they crossed the Kalapani for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
Not only because they crossed, but in the ships, they had to mix all the castes. That's right. and so they lost caste when they entered, as soon as they entered the ship and then crossed the Kalapani. Who knows what happened here for 5 years? Then they would have got married, got relationships, had children or whatever, gone back, been rejected by their village, and then they would come and re-indenture themselves. So sometimes it might be re-indentured originally in Fiji. They'd go back, and then they'd go back to the port and then go back to Mauritius. Right? My wife is actually from Mauritius.
Oh, she's from Mauritius.
And descendant of an indentured laborer as well. So it's interesting, the whole connection and the comparison.
Do you know of any, because like to me, this is one of the most fascinating untold stories, right? Because people think there's a lot of misunderstanding about caste. And what, at least with the Varna system, it was always about ritual purity.
Yes.
Right. And there's this, are you watching that Netflix show Layla?
No, I'm not. What?
This might be very interesting to you. It's basically Handmaid's Tale meets Aryavartan.
Okay.
In the context of global catastrophe and a drought that's murdering Indians. And so this new.
In what year? It's like contemporary, futuristic, past.
It's, you never really know. It's not too far in the future because the vehicles are kind of the same.
Okay.
But so it's definitely a dystopian.
Okay.
But going back to this note, the whole thing that people, depending upon their station, is it their lineages, their destiny.
Yeah.
They get special areas.
Right.
So, and they live in these bubbles, and in these bubbles, they have differential access to air and water.
Okay.
Right. So it really graphically depicts these issues of purity that you were talking about.
Right. Okay.
And the ones that are SOL are the ones that are mixed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. And you know what I mean? For our conversation here, just to let you know, what's interesting too is because our ancestors were pre-partition.
Right.
And so, and from that Calcutta area, so, now it's Bangladesh and India. But, so a lot of the pre-partition culture, it lives here.
Yeah.
Right. So the Hindu-Muslim antagonism is not at all anything like what it is in India today. And so, so we kind of have that, so during the mutiny, for example, the Hindus and Muslims were fighting, together against the East India Company.
Yeah.
And I always like to make that distinction between the East India Company and the British government. It's a very important one.
Yeah. Well, of course, after the mutiny, that difference goes away.
That's why, right? Well, it's the mutiny that destroyed the East India Company and then created, through Disraeli, created the British Empire and Victoria as Empress of India. But that whole East India Company, it ties to the United States as well, since we're having this free-flowing conversation.
And also,
like the Boston Brahmins, right? Right? But that's because of their connection to the East India Company.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And all the ships going, right? And our ancestors too, because a lot of it was to China as well, not only to India. And the impoverishment of the Gangetic Plain, where most of our ancestors come from, has to do with the East India Company changing the entire economic structure, our ancestors had to grow opium to then push into China through Hong Kong. And that caused a lot of the famine, which caused a lot of us, our ancestors, to go. So so all and these things, which are important drivers of world history, you know, and I'm just touching on it briefly here, but they should be so much more widely known. And if we want to have a proper understanding of world history in its respect. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Andre Gunder Frank at all. And
I'm not, but I was like, another book that is very similar, like it seems to be a book up both of our alleys, is called Hungry Empire.
Okay.
And the book talks about how, like, for example, when you're talking
about
opium,
okay, don't worry.
I just, when you asked me, it just came out.
Hungry Empire. Okay.
Yeah, Lindsay Collingham.
Okay.
She first wrote this book called Tales of Curries and Conquerors.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So she's looking at like how why did the British invent curry powder?
Right. Yeah.
Among other things. But the book, what I really like about Hungry Empire is that she's talking about how do these, as you were saying, these imperial or East Indian business practices change food habits. So the people that were growing poppy they had to eat something.
Yeah.
But the wheat was too valuable to let them eat wheat. So they began eating millet.
Right. Okay.
Or later they would begin eating corn that was brought in from the New World because it was so cheap.
Yeah.
But the way that corn is processed by the indigenous Native Americans, which I mean to say all the Americans, they treat it with lye to get the nutrients out of it. The technology of treating the corn with lye did not move to Africa or to India. And so they were being fed large quantities of corn, but they were still starving from malnutrition because the technology so the book talks about that, but you were going to tell me about this other fellow or gal.
Andre Gunder Frank. I mean, his basically he's deceased now, unfortunately, but he developed this world system theory, right? Different, like, so he and Wallerstein were in a huge debate about world systems, plural, which is Wallerstein, and Gunder Frank saying that the current economy is 5,000 years old. It is unbroken. This idea that capitalism is something new is a total Eurocentric misunderstanding of the world economy. I mean, his view of world history is amazing and absolutely perspective changing, in the way that you see that that the world economy actually started with Mohenjo-Daro, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and that economy eventually engulfed the world, and that's what we are in. And Europe entered late, and the centers shifted, and but so anyways, and he has a whole series of pieces looking, rethinking the entire world economy. And one of the pieces I was going to mention to you is just something called the centrality of Central Asia, if you are familiar with it. So, but you don't.
I'm just looking it up. No, I'm looking it up right now.
Yeah. His most famous book before he passed was Reorient. In the 1990s, he was predicting and telling people that, listen, Asia, China and India are going to regain their place in the world economy, and everything is going to shift back again to how it was. And when you combine that with Angus Madison's work with the OECD on the statistics of the global economy from 1 AD to 2050, he projects it to, it just makes you see the world totally different, and just how distorted our narratives of world history are. But yeah, so because I mean, because you have such a, I mean, in our conversation before I invited you on the podcast, you had a nice. I'm gonna read what you wrote. I thought it was.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
I hope it was. I'm kind of snarky.
I'll edit it if there's any language
Profanity.
Yeah. But
Make it safe for work.
Yeah. Let's see. Right. We were talking. You said there's always a fiasco in Afghanistan. Myanmar has I'll say it, no shit, handmade tale with Chinese trafficking, Shan, and Kachin women for birthing babies. No one talks about it as the Rohingya situation takes up the oxygen. In general, militant Buddhism in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and southern Thailand gets no play. So, I mean, we were just talking about all the stuff that's going on in the region.
Or on the periphery.
And the periphery. The dynamic important. I remember reading an article by Surendra Patel in the 1990s from Economic and Political Weekly that changed my whole view about the way the world development was heading. And he was totally right, because he'd been vindicated, and so that helped me predict things as well. So talking about that, the amazing economic transformation that was going on in Asia is not simply relevant for Asians, because that is where most of the dynamism in the world is happening, right there. I mean, that's where most of the economic change and progress, and we don't understand the massive changes, I mean, in just a person's life, from the changes that they've experienced in that whole region is shockingly understudied, not understood, because it has a lot of knock-on effects in the world economy that we don't understand. So yeah.
I mean, let's take the Handmaid's Tale in Myanmar. I mean, I think that's a really interesting example of what you just said. So for years, China had a one-child policy, coupled with male preference. You're at equilibrium. You have these small families, not at replacement rate, with high proportionality of males. Now, this makes clearing the marriage market very difficult. So India doesn't have a problem, even though there's millions of missing women, because basically, if you look at the age pyramid, every subsequent generation is larger. Right.
Yeah.
So
they'll dig in the next generation.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And you I'm sure you've seen this. If you go to India, you'll see relatively young women married to relatively older men. Mm-hmm. And then when he dies, it's often she'll end up being married to one of his younger brothers.
That's right. Yeah.
There's ways of I'm not going to get into that, just the math of it. Well, in China that can't happen because there's zero population growth, so you can't reach into previous or subsequent generations. So what they got to do, they got to steal women, and they're doing this, they're doing this wherever they can. But the situation in Myanmar is the one that I studied, because I was in Myanmar. I was in Myanmar.
Okay. I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's interesting. That's what's happening.
So what they're doing, it is so grotesque. I mean, I'm very rarely shocked, but this really came at me. So it's a combination of money, right? Because these families are small, relatively speaking. They have money because China has been part of this financial success story that you're talking about. In Myanmar, there are numerous ethnic armed insurgencies, and the families have been put into IDP camps for far away from their homes.
And ethnically, are they Burmese?
Oh no! So no, the ethnic Burman is like the aristocrat ethnicity, and everyone who's not Burman has some kind of a conflict with the Burmans.
Because I mean, the Chinese, I know they have their hierarchies and so forth.
So I mean that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, because they take these Burmese, I don't know what you say, Myanmarese.
No. They're specific ethnic groups, right?
Right. They're because they wouldn't just take anybody. Right. I know. Yeah.
Well, it's more. It's not ethnic, really. It's economic. So the Shan and the Kachin, they're ethnic groups. Their husbands are off fighting or they've been killed, and so women in the IDP camps, they've been displaced. and they are unable to pay for their families, and they are given inadequate subsidies to keep their families alive. So they're under a lot of economic pressure to go outside and seek labor. And there is no formal arrangements between China and Myanmar. So they think that they're going to China to get jobs. And what actually happens when they get there is that they're basically forced into reproductive labor. The mother and they're not even married. The man's mother will be frequently very complicit in her rape. They will rape her until she gets married. They're paying as much as like $15,000 to get the youngest girls as possible, subject to them being less likely to miscarry. So it seems to be the ideal age is 15. Younger than 15, you run into birth rates. But after she gives the family, they sell her to another family.
For the same reproductive, like sex slavery, birth slavery, or whatever.
And they recoup much of what they spent if they buy a young woman.
And what, where would this be? Shanghai, Beijing?
No, right on the border with Myanmar. And we know about this because some of these women miraculously escape. And even when they've escaped, you cannot get justice. They can't get their children back. Even the people on the Myanmar side that were involved in trafficking, you can't get them because the amount of money is so high that you can buy off every judge and every law enforcement official. It is truly grotesque. They don't want them as wives. They just want them for children.
Right. And the children come out mixed ethnically. I mean, they're not Han, obviously, the children. Do they look ethnically mixed or what? Have you ever checked that out?
So, you know, the problem, there's no problem. Like when you live on borders, what people look like, right? People are in any event.
That's right.
So, the people who are doing this, if they went to Beijing, they themselves might look like outsiders.
Okay, good.
Right?
Yeah. So they look more like their neighboring Burmese people than they do the Han up in
But it's true. You know, if you were watching The Handmaid's Tale, if you read it, it truly is that because most of the families don't care if their handmaid was African American. Scarcity had a way of diminishing racial preferences.
Right.
Truly.
Because, I mean, you saw that in slavery in America as well.
Of course. Right.
At
the end of the day,
there was a racial caste system in the South, and it was cross-sexually very often, you know. Right. And what you're saying there sounds very interesting because it immediately brings to mind the Gulf states and the tremendous effect they've had on the region and sucking in labor, women, maids to go there and work.
And abusing them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, under horrendous conditions under which those great cities and whatever are built. It's interesting. And these are massive movements of humanity, which is really sort of under the radar of people who purport to know about what's going on in the world, you know. And that's I mean, as you were pointing to all these things all around in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, and then aggressive Buddhism. I think that, you know, like
it's horrible.
They're
genocidal.
Yeah, I mean, I laugh because of the image of Buddhism in the world as a sort of peaceful monk, bald-headed, and I mean, and when you see how the junta in Myanmar deals with the Rohingya, or in Sri Lanka how they deal with the Tamil Tigers,
Southern Thailand how they deal with the Muslims.
Yeah, why don't you shed some of your insight onto that?
I mean, there's no insight. I mean, every religion is weaponizable. But when I was single and dating online, which is how I met my husband, I had to have in my profile, if you're a Buddhist convert, click the profile above or below. because I got tired of having this conversation. One, Buddhist converts are clueless about
You mean,
actual
oh,
Buddhists.
in the West, right? So, okay,
Yes,
yeah, yeah,
yes, yes, yes.
A Western Buddhist convert, yeah, yeah.
I mean, they've got their Buddhist prayer flags. They think Buddhists are vegetarian. They think, Buddhists play with gongs. And, at the first date, I'm just like wanting to strangle this person. And and of course, how do you know that they're a Buddhist convert? They tell you. And so I said, well, have you ever been to a Buddhist country? Because if you have gone to a Buddhist country, you would know that everything that you just said is absurd. Most Buddhists are not vegetarians. Whether you go to Nepal, Burma, good pork curry can be had in Myanmar. And they're not peaceful. I mean, we only recently knew about the Rohingya, but they've actually been doing this to the Rohingya now for decades. And other non-Buddhist ethnic minorities in Myanmar. Sri Lanka, from the beginning, Sri Lanka and Pakistan have a lot in common in the sense that Pakistan views itself as the homeland for South Asia's Muslims. Sri Lankan Buddhists believe that they're the homeland for Buddhists.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so they view anyone, there's always going to be a fear of a demographic threat. So they don't just look at the Tamils, who tend to be Christian and Hindu on the island on their own terms, but they also, it's similar to how Israel views Arabs.
Palestinians, yeah.
Yeah, so they'll look at Palestinians, and it's a small number, but they then look at all of the Arab states behind them, and they create this hysteria that they're going to be driven into the sea. Well, the Buddhists of Sri Lanka are very similar. They look at their island, it's a small, but then you have this large Tamil population in India, and their narrative is they're going to drive us into the sea.
Right.
And then what I have noticed, there's some common themes going across the region. India right now, under its Hindu chauvinist prime minister, and the reason why there is one is that people are increasingly becoming intolerant of their non-Hindu countrymen. This whole idea of love jihad, that Muslims and Christians are just trying to bang their way to make Indians no longer Hindu. You have the love jihad claims also in Sri Lanka, in southern Thailand, and also Myanmar. And to me, it's very similar to the
love jihad of what? Tamil
Muslims. Muslims.
Oh, Muslims. So it is against Muslims. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And who would be the Muslim population there?
Where?
In Sri Lanka.
Oh, there's a large Muslim population.
Is it native Sri Lankan, or is it like?
It is so diverse. It is so diverse. And when I first started going to Sri Lanka,
are they Sinhalese ethnically, or?
They are everything.
Okay.
They're such a complicated. But so back in decades ago, you could identify them distinctively because they all had different ways of dressing, especially the women. In the last several decades, as you've seen elsewhere, there's been this push for women to wear hijab and niqab.
Yes.
And so there's like this homogenization.
That's spreading Wahhabism throughout the world, I think.
I mean, it's you see it. I've seen it everywhere.
Yeah.
You also
in Trinidad. I mean, and it comes from the Saudi Wahhabi missionaries, basically.
I mean, I would say a lot of Gulf migration.
That's right. Yeah, that's
right. There's this huge circle, and then with respect. So as a female, I've seen a lot of variation in how hijab is used. So So I am less, I don't get freaked out when I see it because I've seen, let me give you an example. So I was living in Mumbai one summer. I love to run. I have to wake up really early to run before it became insufferably hot. And you're running in the rain, right? So these are, I loved it. But all along Marine Drive, there would be these rocks. And at this heinous hour of the wet morning, I'm seeing women full up in burqa with their boyfriends.
Right.
As you go up Sea Link Road, like in the evening, it's pretty romantic, and people will be on their motorcycles. You'll see women full on burqas, basically dry humping their boyfriends on motorcycles, right? I've seen prostitutes use burqas to disguise themselves.
Right.
I've seen young students wear burqas so that their fathers will trust them to go to school.
Yeah.
And then I've also seen burqa as a fashion, right? You can go online and you can learn how to do the bump it. You can learn how to do all the folds with the hair pieces and the pins. So for women,
and the burqa, I mean, the niqab is the one where it's just your eyes are showing.
Just your eyes are showing,
and the burqa does not show your face either, does it?
Oh, so burqa typically just refers to something that's covering you. So niqab.
Okay, all right. So okay, so I wasn't. All right, I wasn't sure if you meant the full, because I think we refer here the burqa more full covering as opposed to the hijab.
Exactly. So, well, hijab is actually just covers your head, not your face. That's right,
exactly, and shoulders and
niqab is the thing that if you're wearing niqab, only your eyes are showing.
That's right.
Or there'll be like a veil that comes over your face.
Yeah, that's an even more dread one.
Well, from my point of view, if you have to wear that shit, it's actually the easiest, because if you're eating, you can just do this.
Yeah.
Like some of the women, they wear one big chador and they wrap it around.
Yeah.
That makes eating really difficult because you have this huge. I've done it all. I've worn every imaginable. I have an entire wardrobe.
Yeah, I've seen you posted a picture of you wearing one and carrying something on your head. Yeah.
Oh, that was just a dupatta, because I was in Bamiyan. But so from my point of view, I see when women wear this, it's a multivalent action, right?
Yeah.
It's sometimes it's fashion, sometimes it's social pressure, but
everything can always be modified culturally, and then all the recognizable human things of status, of sexuality, of all that stuff can be expressed in even the most repressive cultural.
But I'll tell you though, the signifier, which is more important to me, is when we see men changing their dress. Right? And there's a couple of things to look out for, because you can wear this and not necessarily be a Salafi. But when men have their suits tailored so that the hem falls above their ankles, right, or if they stop wearing Western clothes altogether in preference for a local, whether it's a thobe, whether it's a shalwar kameez like thing, but they have the trouser hem above their ankle. Another thing I've observed is how they grow their beards. First of all, if they grow a beard.
Yes.
To how they grow a beard. Is it this? Is it this? And have they shaved this here?
Yeah.
Right. So those things, I find how men are changing to be a much more reliable market signal than how the women are dressing.
Yeah.
Right. But the love jihad, to me, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. I said, let me get this straight. You are telling me that Muslim men are more attractive, they satisfy women better, maybe they have better endowments.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you're basically saying, and therefore I give up. Why don't you learn some foreplay? Why don't you learn some manners?
Okay, let's get a little bit politically incorrect here too, because I mean, the migrant situation in Sweden, right? And in Europe, where it's overwhelmingly women who are saying we are welcoming refugees, and it's overwhelmingly male Syrians and whatnot coming across, and there are lots of reported. I mean, I'm not talking about the rape part.
I know what you mean.
But also the relationships between, at the same time as a sort of feminist kind of gender wars and stuff are occurring among the white Swedish population, then they're embracing, these Muslim men who have no gender sensitivity. It's it's mind-boggling.
So I mean, on the love jihad, the love jihad isn't real. Right? Muslims, I mean, the idea that Muslims are deliberately doing this. I mean, at least in the case of the India's NIA, their National Investigative Agency, looked at this and found this just to be a bunch of horseshit. This is just a bunch of communal talking points.
Right.
But I think there's the similarity between this and what you just spoke about in the United States. What I have been fascinated by is how this plays out in the context of the communal divides in India, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, where you have Hindus versus Muslims, Buddhists versus Muslims. They are saying basically, who has access to our women? And they have hyper-sexualized the myth of the Muslim.
Right.
And they'll tell you, oh no, we're not anti-Muslim. Look, we've got Muslim cricket players. We have Muslims in films. And to me, I'm like, aha, yeah, I've seen this before. It's just like the African-American male in the United States, whereby nothing will make a white supremacist more angry than a white woman being with a black man.
Yeah.
They hypersexualize him. He is construed as a danger. He is construed as someone who's going to dilute the white race, to use their vernacular. And you'll see once you think about it, like we had this this Bachelor show, right?
Yeah.
And we had this Bachelorette show. We had a black bachelorette and she chose a white male.
Yeah. The
day you have a black bachelor who is in the position of choosing a white male, then I'll believe my country has changed. Right. Because that is ultimately the thing that is the biggest fuck you to a white nationalist, is a black man selecting a white woman who wants him and doing that publicly. And the UK, I mean, it's the same thing. I was in a serious relationship with a Sikh, turban Sikh in London. You know, we would get it from both sides. Like the Indian, he was Punjabi, obviously. The Punjabis did not accept us. They weren't very happy about it. But the white Britons were violent. If we were in a pub together, people would try to take his turban off. People would say really
What
horrible
years
things.
were that, by the way?
Those were many years.
Like 70s?
No, we are.
Oh, wait, what I was saying. Yeah, I forgot your age. Yeah.
Late 90s.
No, but what I was thinking of is because
late 90s.
That sounds like National Front kind of stuff. But
it's just shitty human stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, so for me, and of course when people
90s, that's quite interesting for the 90s, because you know, the discourse. I mean, I was in the UK in the 90s, and I mean, it was not the same thing as the 70s.
Were you dating a white woman? I'm curious.
No. Yeah, no, I wasn't actually.
Pretend you're dating a white woman today. You'll still get it. You'll still get it. You may even get more of it now, because the white racism has been enabled by all these regimes.
Right. You know, I as we're talking about these cross current things, even outside of the South Asian context, and it's not a problem, I guess, that we're going outside of it. It's interesting.
Well, my dissertation was technically on the diaspora.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So I was
the Indian diaspora.
The Sikh diaspora.
The Sikh diaspora. Okay.
Yeah, in particular.
Right. Oh, right, because you also mentioned the Khalistanis here, which is interesting.
Exactly.
Because Canada and Jagmeet Singh, and then his connection and all that. And Canada's weird refugee policy. They take all the terrorist groups and well,
I'm not going to say that, but I will say, when on the Khalistan issue, Khalistan died in India around 1992.
Yeah.
It never died in the diaspora. I mean,
exactly.
Right. Here in the U.S., Canada, the U.K., you could always tell a Gurdwara, the leanings by whether or not they had been Dhanwale's picture up with all the historical martyrs.
Yeah. One of my PhD supervisors was I'm sure he was a Khalistan. He never said it, but he was.
Oh, what was his name?
Who was it? Gurmeet Singh. at the University of Hull. He was just there a few. He was just I shouldn't say supervisor, examiner. It was just at my Viva Voce. So he was just one of the guys there, and I never had a strong relationship. But he yeah. I always remember that. But yeah, sorry, you were going on about the gurdwaras and the pictures.
But Khalistan's back in India. I have a database about about 60 or so attacks. Bhindranwale is back in the gurdwaras. Little kids, I have pictures of them running around in Bhindranwale t-shirts. Bhindranwale paraphernalia. He's been sort of reconfigured as like this Sikh Che Guevara, and again, people forget that Che Guevara was a murderous prick too.
Yes. No, yeah.
But he's exactly that. And I asked a mother, her kid was probably 10, and I said, why is he wearing this T-shirt with Bhindranwale? And she said, oh, bache hain is tarah. And I was like, lekin tu si maa ho.
Yeah.
You're his mother, and letting him run around. I mean, he could get killed like this.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I was just really appalled.
Yeah, this is something else that is very peripheral, but I think you're probably a good person to ask this, since we're in this conversation. It's tangentially related. One thing I noticed, we were talking about styles of men in the United States among white men. After, like in the 2000s, I think it was, the beard became a fashion statement among young guys in their 20s.
Yeah.
I just thought that was so, because it looked, and they were unkempt beards. They looked Muslim, right? And
or like a Nihang Sikh.
Yeah. And I just thought that was so weird, because while the war on terror is going on, and you have all the, Osama bin Laden and the war in Iraq, and you have all this sort of virulent, anti-Muslim, anti-Jihad before ISIS and everything. You also had all the young guys growing beards, and then after they overthrew Saddam Hussein, there was the election of Barack Hussein Obama. It was just like I don't know. I think there's something there that's just
so I mean, about the hair thing,
I don't know. It's like a kind of a rejection of the foreign policy. I don't know, what is it. Have you thought about that?
Barack Obama clearly was, right. He was sort of a literal repudiation of Bush, and everyone thought Bush was racist. So in retrospect, he probably wasn't a racist. I think he had said in interviews that the thing that hurt him most was being accused of a racist. And the accusations mostly came around the context of Hurricane Katrina, but he had a very diverse cabinet. I mean, so in retrospect, he may have been a lot of terrible things, but maybe a racist wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
So definitely Obama. I just think it's hard to know whether or not his unique background contributed to his charisma, right? So I mean, he could have also have been named, Conway East, and if he had been Barack Obama, he would have been elected. But the hair thing, I have to say, I've been struck by that too. And because and there's been a couple of things, and I couldn't possibly say whether they're related, but I spent a lot of time on bases. And the special operator, the so-called person that's going out and doing really bad things to what we are told really bad people, they all have these beards. Yeah. And the one thing that you'll notice if you're watching TV, everything is tactical sunglasses, tactical flashlight, tactical vests, tactical pants, which I think are just pants with pockets.
Yeah.
Everything is fucking tactical. And so I think this hair and the fetishization of everything tactical is coming out of these war movies.
Could be, yeah.
Right, but you have to make a distinction, because they're the tactical fetishists, and and they're the ones that everything is tactical. Probably their underwear is tactical. Their condoms are tactical. You don't see them coming. I don't know. But what comes out of that is this response, which is the hipster beard, right? This is the dude, and these beards are meticulously groomed.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
These are not free range beards.
Right.
They have special grooming products.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do special, and their hair is
Yeah. They have these like this.
soft.
Yeah. And then these huge beards that just seems totally incongruous.
But those beards are very
Yeah.
groomed.
Yeah, I've seen some that are extremely, I guess you could say, with the Sikh care in a sense. And then but then there's others I've seen. I don't know this name.
So like the Duck Dynasty crowd.
Yeah.
Right. Where they, so
I wonder if it, I don't know if you're familiar with William Dalrymple's work on like
White Mughals.
Yeah. I wonder how much of it has to do with kind of, I guess, so many Americans have been in Afghanistan, have been in the Middle East service, and then maybe just adopted the style and it's become an aesthetic.
But actually, though, the style that they're adopting isn't that, right? The style, the hipster, so the whole hipster thing, by the way, the hipsters were popular before America. Like, I was in South India, and those dudes, because like many gentlemen in South India have this really beautiful, naturally curly hair.
Yeah.
And oh my God, they had the most amazing hipster hairdos.
Yeah.
They had this incredible, their hair, I would die for that hair, except for the hair on the face.
Yeah.
So actually, the hipster stuff did not originate in the United States. I saw it, and I remember when I would transit through Europe, I was like, please don't let this come to the U.S. Please. Just stop, right, with pointy shoes. But no, it's all, and in fact, here's my husband. My husband loves pointy shoes, and he loves hipster hair.
Right.
And then the other thing about hipsters, which again, we imported it, we didn't export it. The excessive infatuation with everything tactical, and the Duck Dynasty beard, that is very much, I think, an artifact of this war culture.
Yeah. That's interesting. So
not all beards are alike.
That's right.
Be careful. And for that matter, even the hipster hairdo.
Yeah.
You have to be very careful. We were in line at a movie, and I don't think you know this, but I got into some trouble with the white supremacists because I got this Nazi dude kicked out of my gym and was harassed for a very long time. What was his name? Richard Spencer.
Okay.
Yeah, so I got him kicked out of the gym. And so we're in line, and this Hitler Youth hairdo has been quite popular among racists. The problem is the Hitler Youth versus hipster douche hairdo. Yeah. It's a thin line of hairdo.
Yeah. No, It's
The Washington Post even ran an article. How do you distinguish between the hipster hairdo and the Hitler Youth do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I mean the aesthetic of 1920s, 30s Germany, the Bauhaus movement and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's tied. It's inextricable. I mean, it comes from the same aesthetic.
But trying to explain that to a hipster.
And to get back to the complexity of the region and stuff, like it's like in America where the Sikh Gurdwara was shot up because the person thought they were Muslim. Right? Where a Sikh beard is tied up with the net.
Not all of them.
Yeah, not all of them, but a lot of the older gentlemen and whatnot.
Yeah, they will
have it like that, and so even the way beards are kept, it's part of this complex cultural signaling, and I guess it ties back to what we were talking about with the food, and that there are all sorts of minute and unlike in the United States, where it's a statement of personal style, and you can go through the phase for 5 years or 2 years or 6 months or whatever, and then try something else. These are social markers, caste markers that are lifetime things.
Exactly.
And it's it's so.
I mean, the easiest shorthand for a racist. How do you tell a Sikh from a Muslim? In the United States or Canada or the United Kingdom, Muslims aren't wearing turbans.
That's right.
If you see a dude in a turban or a chick, they're Sikh.
Yeah.
It,
Exactly.
that you can never go wrong with that rule of thumb.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask your opinion about. Let me see. I You see, we've been on the call long, and this might take me too long. So let me just shortcut it. Because I wanted to talk about the fragmentation of the region and all that, but I think that would take us much too long. There's too much to talk about there, and
that's another one.
Exactly, because that's what all this leads to, in my view, in any case. But given your experience, and I'd probably ask you to elaborate a bit on your experience in that. But the United States' role in the region, right? Because I think your involvement started with Afghanistan in the region. Is that correct?
No, India.
India. Okay. All right. But the United States involvement in the, because okay, let me just give you my narrative, and you may disagree with it, but the breakup of the subcontinent is, has been part of the great game from the 19th century. And I think it's been, definitely part of the geopolitical strategy of the Anglo-American establishment, basically. And that, the very foundation of Pakistan is kind of part of that, the Kashmir issue, and the fact that the region remains so underdeveloped. And I mean, the Rand Corporation, which you work for, has talked about.
They call it the Rund Corporation. Let's pronounce it correctly. It's Rund.
And they, I mean, the fact that it's easier for Sri Lanka to do business with Brazil than it is with Nepal, or India with cheaper for India to deal with Brazil rather than Pakistan. This contributes to the impoverishment of the region and so forth, and division. And so America supporting Pakistan for so long, you talked about Pakistan being a client state. And my understanding of that is that it's been a major purchaser for the American military complex and military industrial complex. And then also a kind of supplier of jihadists for clients around the region as well. And so Britain was a huge source of sort of instability in the region. America, what's your view of America's role? Especially now, the relations with India is changing. Do you think that the unification of the subcontinent or greater connections between them is something that needs to be done, that has to be done, or can't be done, or that's not on your radar at all? I just want to get your thoughts on that. I had to just touch many points because of time, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from.
No, I do. And so I do disagree historically.
Yeah.
The British did not want, remember, not all parts of what we call South Asia were a part of the Raj. So Afghanistan never was, for example. Afghanistan was never formally colonized. It was under British suzerainty for a significant period. It was never colonized. Nepal was never colonized. Sri Lanka was variously colonized, but even though it eventually became a British subject, it was not part of the Raj. Myanmar was part of the Raj after the final Anglo-Burmese War, but actually Myanmar insisted, Burma insisted upon not being a part of the Raj because they didn't want any more Indian migrants, which is partly how we get the Rohingya issues, among others. So from 1937 onward, Burma is a separate colony. Yeah. So in some sense, a lot of these divisions were not, it had nothing to do with the British. So what we're really talking about then is Pakistan, India, and what is today Bangladesh. Similarly, the Maldives are not part of this security architecture. So the British built this very elaborate and extensive security architecture with the sole purpose of multi-purposes, but one important purpose was to fend off incursions from the Russians and also incursions from the Chinese. And also they used the Raj to provide manpower and bureaucratic infrastructure to the rest of the empire, right? So this is how we get Sardars in Kenya and Tanzania as a part of building the railway. This is how we get Sardars actually all over Southeast Asia. They go as police, they go as military, they go as Navy, and also how we get Sardars here in the United States on the West Coast as early as the 18th century, right? Because they are the sepoys, they're the dragoons, right? They're the imperial dragoons. And so the British did not want to break up South Asia. I think this is a really common misconception. And the reason why is that the security competitions that emerged post World War II, they were still the same, but now it's not Imperial Russia, it is the Soviet Union. And then we will soon have revolutionary China, right? Breaking up the empire was done so reluctantly because it was felt that how will these India and Pakistan fend off these predatory empires to the north? And the way partition came around was essentially a series of important decisions that would leave the Indian National Congress in a really bad place. So during the First World War, the Indian National Congress, they supported the war, even though they were not consulted in the decision, and obviously it had implications for Indians going to war. During the Second World War, they protested the war and they were arrested and they were put into jail. So the irony is that the British really could not stand Jinnah. I mean, the archival material in this is really clear. They just thought he was a pompous ass. But because the Indian National Congress, whom they preferred to interact with, was in jail, there was no interlocutor. And so and this is happening as the demand for Pakistan is strengthening, and as the Indian National Congress is really failing many Muslims in the sense that they were increasingly pulling out Hindu tropes. Muslims felt that maybe the two-nation theory had more validity than they had originally thought in 1937. So by the time we get to the 46-47 elections, the Muslim League sweeps and it's seen as an endorsement. And the Indian National Congress had just lost this place because they were in jail during the war. And in the end, I mean, Jinnah was a jerk. I mean, in my view, I'm not someone that thinks Jinnah was a mastermind. He was using the two-nation theory to really extract maximal concessions from the Indian National Congress in a unified national parliament. He said that Muslims and Hindus were equal, therefore we should have equal representation in a unified parliament. Indian National Congress, of course, said one person, one vote. That's not only is that an absurd violation of it, it's just simply unacceptable. And remember that the British actually sped up by 1 year. They were originally going to decolonize by 48, and they sped it up to 47. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League feared that if they didn't agree to a constitutional dispensation, that the British would reverse their decision and stick around for another year. So Indian National Congress, seeing that there was no way they were going to negotiate with Jinnah, said, fine, here's your Pakistan, be done with it. So, and the British were really, 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 really reluctant to do this. Auchinleck, who was the British commander overseeing both forces, was just devastated. And what he said, he saw that a viable Pakistan was going to be very difficult. He predicted that Pakistan was going to fail and fall back into India anyway. So this idea that this was a terrible thing that's happening, it's not tenable, it's not going to last, but obviously it did last. And I think some of the worst fears um, haven't really come true, in the sense that uh, because of the Soviet Union, because of alliance policies, Pakistan was able to get this U.S. support. Again, a lot of historical misunderstandings. The U.S. preferred to partner with India. This is like repeatedly demonstrated by both American and Indian authors, and it's in our archives, our national security archives. But Nehru eschewed the United States. He eschewed alliances, period. And
Right.
he preferred this state-driven economy, which did not serve India at all, right? So I think there's this tendency to put everything on the United States. But I think a lot of what happened it was overdetermined by how partition played out.
Yeah.
And then obviously with the Soviet Union being a victor at World War II, it had a place at the UN Security Council, right?
Yeah.
And it was also one of the permanent nuclear weapon states.
Yeah.
Had the Soviet Union not basically declared open war on the West, much of what happened in South Asia would not have happened, right? So you do a lot of counterfactuals, but I don't think really anyone, and I'm pretty cynical, I don't think this divide and I understand the Indian point of view, because the British really were interested in dividing and ruling.
Yeah.
The Indians themselves do a very good job of dividing and ruling.
Yeah.
I mean, they've actually maintained a lot of continuity with the British. But this was never something that the Americans wanted to do.
Yeah.
This was never seen as desirable.
I don't think at the micro level, like the way the British did in terms of their management of the Raj, but yeah. Well, okay. Let me
because from the American point of view, it causes more grief.
Exactly.
There is this. Yeah. Because if there were to be, for example, a nuclear exchange, there are very few countries in the world that would have to come in and clean it up.
Yeah.
So the biggest concern of the U.S. is these nuclear weapons, particularly on the Pakistan side, proliferate, especially as you move into battlefield nuclear weapons, that the U.S. is going to have to clean this shit up.
Yeah.
All else equal, we would, and then from the point of view of trade, South Asia, I think one of the reasons why there are so many problems, and you kind of talked about this, that it's easier for Sri Lanka to trade with some Southeast Asian states. The protectionism that, for example, India engages in, you understand it politically, but it doesn't help India.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, all of these countries would be behooved by trade. Yeah.
I mean, the region. I mean, if there were freer trade between these nations, GDP would be up significantly. And India is already, by PPP measures, the third largest economy in the world now.
Yeah. I mean, India is the biggest. India, I think, harms itself the most. I mean, that's why things like SARC have just been. India has done better ironically, India has done better under bilateral agreements than it has under regional agreements. Right.
Yeah. I mean, so I suppose there are a lot of questions about the U.S. role in the region that I'd like to ask you, but because of time, perhaps we can have another discussion later. But I guess to give a little overview that we could walk away with. You teach a lot of diplomats, is that right? Or people in the foreign service, is that correct?
I teach, it's a mix. I teach people who are already in government.
Yeah.
I teach people who want to be in government.
Right.
And where they are in the government, unless they tell me, I don't ask.
Right. Okay.
Right.
I mean, so is there a kind? I know that the academy doesn't necessarily work this way, but there's an official view that's pushed, that's explicit. Maybe there's an implicit one, but do you see a sort of view of the region, as some sort of integrated view of the region of what its place is in the world today and where it should be, where the American government might like it to be? Is there any sort of strategic thinking along those lines, whether, evil or well-intentioned or anything like that?
No, I mean, I think part of the reason you have to think of one of the reasons that we don't have this unified view in the US government is that every bureaucracy chops up the world differently, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest conductor of diplomacy is actually the US military, which people forget. It's got these enormous resources. The current regime operating in DC may reject climate change, but the military knows that that's not true. And so Pacific Command is still operating under the belief that climate change is a major international security threat, for example. So when it comes to the region that we're talking about, Pacific Command divides the space. Pacific Command is basically India and East, and US Central Command is Pakistan and Afghanistan and much of the Middle East, right? So one of the most important commands doesn't even view this region as geographically continuous. The State Department and its bureau, it reorganized some years ago to be South and Central Asia, which is some nod to the old Silk Trail, right? And this idea that in this old pre-modern space of logistical corridors for commerce, but it excludes Myanmar and Thailand because that's Southeast Asia.
Right.
So if you look at the different government bureaucracies, they divide this space up differently.
Right.
Sometimes Afghanistan is considered part of South Asia, sometimes it's considered part of Central Asia.
Right.
So if you don't have a bureaucratic lens, if you don't have bureaucratic lenses that are all seeing the region in the same way, you can't have a singular strategy towards the region because each bureaucracy has a strategy towards the regions that it sees, if that makes sense.
No, I totally understand. So let me ask you from your vantage point, from your work, because you often go to the region, and I've seen you speak at India.
I just came back.
And you
and
speak at forums
again.
all over. Where do you see, do you see, okay, I guess the thing is, where do you see the region in, let's say, 10 years and 50 years, if you can project, if that's possible to project?
Yeah, so I don't really do that kind of stuff because it depends so much upon elections.
Yeah.
Right.
And accidents of history, which can change everything.
Exactly. So I don't tend to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
India remains kind of like an 8-ball. India not only has these I mean that in the magical 8-ball sense.
Okay.
Because not only do you have the federal elections, right? The general elections.
Yeah.
Each state has its own election. And each state, as I said, it's its own operating environment.
Yeah.
And these states also affect India's foreign relations. So what happens in Tamil Nadu will, in a considerable measure, affect India's policy towards Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
What happens in West Bengal and Assam will affect India's policies towards Bangladesh. What happens on the communal issues will affect how India supports or doesn't support the Rohingya.
Yeah.
So India is just very, very complicated. Pakistan, I can tell you with complete certitude that nothing really changes.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan, I can tell you with complete certitude, if we pull out and we take our check with us, Afghanistan will probably look more like it did in the 1990s than it did in 2009.
Right.
And Bangladesh is another interesting one. Bangladesh is a really good example of really bad governance, but a really good economy. And it kind of goes to show that you can have the worst governance, and it routinely tops the world's list of worst governance.
Yeah.
But it has had exceptional macroeconomic growth. It is no longer a developing country. It has moved into that middle tier of quasi-developed countries. And then the big question looming all over this is China, right? With its One Belt, One Road. Is it, as I believe, the new form of colonialism, as we've seen, where it goes and it puts all this infrastructure in, it debts that no one can repay, and then it just gets a piece of sovereign territory, as it has done in several places. It did it in Hambantota, it did it in Malaysia, recently did it as well in a country in East Africa. I'm forgetting which one. And that was in addition to basically a China enclave at Djibouti. And most certainly this is going to happen at Gwadar, right? So is this a benign force for development as China claims, or is this really a geopolitical version of what it's doing in the South China Seas, which is just basically taking someone else's stuff and making it their own and then militarizing it? So it's hard to do what you asked.
Yeah, in a sense, probably from an American lens, I would guess that if there's anything that can sort of, you know, put the region together, it would be as in relation to the U.S. relationship to China, I suppose, now that you bring it up. Because I think that the U.S. relationship to China is probably their first concern. And then how does the region fit into that, whether it be Pakistan or India or Bangladesh? And probably it will, from a U.S. perspective, it will always take second place to whatever is going on with China. Would you agree with that in general?
I mean, when we had a more competent leadership, when our allies of all stripes could be more dependent upon us, I'm not sure that was true.
Mm-hmm.
But our current leadership is so dangerous and so erratic and unpredictable. And you have to be very careful to discern the differences, if any, between the tweet state and the deep state.
Yeah.
I think it's hard for our allies to know. And I mean, for example, just look at what's happened at the UN, which is one of the few places where the US has behaved responsibly. Our traditional partners are abstaining because they don't want to irritate China. Yeah. And perhaps under a different dispensation, they would be more supportive of American initiatives to hold Myanmar to account. But they also don't forget Russia. I mean, Russia is increasing its footprint in Afghanistan. It's reaching out to Pakistan in ways that it traditionally would not have done out of interest to India. So we're seeing just a lot of realignments as the United States is in relative terms is in a state of decline.
Right. And sorry, one final thing. Okay, now that you mentioned it, and I should have brought it up before, but Kashmir, what's your view of the situation? How do you think it's going to play out?
Well, so the first thing is, I don't recognize a dispute in Kashmir. India has an accession, instrument of accession. When Pakistan grosses about the plebiscite, even a person with third grade reading comprehension can read the UN Security Council resolution text and see that Pakistan is just, it just lies. It lies, and no one calls its bluff.
And it has no claim. There's no claim except they're Muslim. That's it. And, and I don't know why the international media, from the BBC, who should know better, if anybody should know anything.
That I can't explain. I mean, I spent a lot of my time educating the public, and I'm actually trying to meet Ilhan Omar to explain this to her, because I actually think she's educable when she's pointed out facts. So what Pakistan does on its website, its website to the UN Permanent Mission, is that it deliberately uses language from the Radcliffe Commission to make a case that it should go there. But of course, the Radcliffe Commission didn't pertain to Kashmir. The only text that matters is the Indian Independence Act of 1947. And it's clear, Pakistan had nothing. Now, if Pakistan wanted to make a claim to Junagadh, that claim would be legitimate, right? But it's not making a claim to Junagadh. Also, it makes claims to Hyderabad. Hyderabad didn't want to join Pakistan at all. It wanted to remain independent. So from my point of view, I think that the international community should just stop indulging Pakistan and simply hold it accountable for what it has done, which is killed a lot of people. Having said that, on the Indian side, I am confused by, and I think everyone knows I'm a liberal, right? So I've lost friends on both sides. I've lost friends on the Hawk side and from the liberal side, because Article 370 was never about Muslims in Kashmir. Article 370 was always about Jammu Hindus, because as Maharaja Hari Singh, who was a Hindu Dogra king, was marginalized the Hindus in Jammu were afraid as Muslim politics became the politics of the valley under the National Conference. So Article 370 enshrined the laws of a Dogra king to appease Hindus in Jammu. I keep asking Indians, when did a measure meant to appease an embattled minority become the sine qua non of izzat of Kashmiri Muslims? And people look at me like I have just asked them to build a spacecraft. Mm. First, they have forgotten this fact of Article 370, and not a single person has been able to answer my question. The people who have been most irritated by this question have themselves been Kashmiri Muslims, and they assume I'm being an asshole. I said, I'm actually not being an asshole. I study history. I notice this fact, and what I can't see is when did this thing to appease Hindus in Jammu become the sine qua non of your izzat? Article 370 was a discriminatory law. It had to go. And what I don't like is that the Congress Party didn't do it earlier, right? Yeah. Because had it done it, it would not have had this communal feel. It would have deprived this very Hindu chauvinist party of one of its communal to-do list items, which is this, followed by Ayodhya, which has also happened, followed by the Uniform Civil Code. So I'm of the view that A370 had to go. It's a good thing that it went. However, the party that did it and the reasons behind it are unfortunate. Having said all of those things, what India is currently doing in 370 is not serving its purposes. And I think they're going to keep this clamp down well until the first snow, right? Yeah.
And in fact, I have Dr. Shashi Tharoor will be coming on in 2 weeks. So
ask him this question about Article 370.
Okay.
I mean, he might, and I ordinarily I would see him at Raisina Dialogue, but I am banned now from the Raisina Dialogue because I had the temerity to complain that their Me Too panel was moderated by a white male German, and on the panel they had an Egyptian man mansplaining FGM to a room that had about 30 women from countries where FGM is a reality. The punishment of truth telling. So now I am banned from Raisina. So ask Shashi. I mean, he might know. He's a smart dude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 370 and why Congress didn't do it?
No. When did this instrument to appease Jammu Hindus become the sine qua non of Kashmiri Muslim izzat? I just don't understand when or how.
Yeah, the autonomy. Because it's portrayed as Muslim autonomy that it was granted.
But that was never the case. It was always because remember Maharaja Harda Singh was a Hindu.
Yeah.
How could enshrining his laws at the time of the signing of the Instrument of Accession be about autonomy for Muslims?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like people like they brain fart on the history.
Yes. No, exactly. Yeah. But I suppose, I mean, just trying to think of why that is. Maybe it's because of the way I can't remember. Is it Omar Abdullah and the family? The way they used it to entrench their dynastic power.
But it would still require like really some crazy remarketing scheme, like saying that McDonald's Big Macs are healthy for you is a part of a diet conscious about cholesterol.
Yeah.
Right. I need to get going. I have a meeting.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So
this was great fun.
Yeah, it was. So I want to thank you for the interview and also all your work, your intelligence and your insight that you.
Oh, you're being too kind. but thank you. This was really, really fun.
Thank you. It's been enlightening as well. So that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.